Hey, history students, this is Mr. Baker again. This is Baker's Backyard, Baker's Corner. Wanted to actually lead you into another weekly discussion on a skill that is basically one of the more important skills of young historians and certainly young students of history and even those that write about history for a living. And that is the place of contextualization with studying history. And so all of you have probably heard the word context before in some way, shape, or form. What we want to do today is, first of all, we want to understand a good working definition of what this means in the place of history. And most importantly, guys, how we can actually apply it with our weekly study of history. And I would argue the study of history throughout our lives. So let's go ahead and get started. This will be a quick session. So contextualization is one of those things that, again, is kind of like the historian or the student of history trying to figure out, okay, what do I already know about a time period or something preceding a time period or whatever that is going to allow me to basically understand and show a person, your teacher, whoever it might be, that I know something about what is developing with history. Okay, so the basic definition of contextualization, if you want to pause the screen to actually write this down, it might be helpful, is defined as the quote, influence that shapes a given situation. All right, we'll get to the rest of it in a second. But guys, think about what that means. Like when we're talking about influence, we're talking about something that could be seen as something that leads to something happening, right? Or something that basically produces some kind of understanding about what's eventually going to be an outcome. Okay, so in my class, those of you that studied the Federalist era with President Washington, okay, think about, when you're looking at him passing the torch to somebody like John Adams, right, who's going to be the second and final Federalist president. Think about, guys, the context. What's going on during the era of George Washington's presidency that kind of paves the way for issues and different things that are popping up, economic, social, political, etc. Okay, so why do we have the development of political parties, right? Those are going to play a big role with American politics moving forward. Okay, what's going to be the precedence of Washington with how he dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion and things along the lines of appointing a cabinet to give him advice that he eventually, with neutrality, decides, well, I hear what you're saying, but you know what, we're going to take it in a different direction. Okay, so you're basically setting up an understanding of what basically comes before a historical era is going to happen. Now, there is a case to be made that we can use context in different places during and after, but a lot of people contend, for good reason, that setting up an argument or an understanding usually precedes the events that come afterwards. Okay, so just keep that in mind. In short, it is establishing background. We've all heard the term background, things that we know that influences the topic of study, or quote, setting the scene for the historical situation that you intend to both describe and explain. Okay, so think about it like this. If you're describing, the first presidency that preceded, Adams, and you're like, well, you know what? Washington had a two-term tradition. He had, the establishment of a Bill of Rights that was a part of the time period. He can't physically do that as president, right? He can't say, here's the Bill of Rights, we're going to do it. All right. But he can certainly have, that happen while he's in office, creating a cabinet of advisors. Okay. Those are all factual things. The explanation would be, political parties developed under President Washington, and the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, they stood for these issues. John Adams' administration is going to have to figure out, how do you follow in the footsteps of neutrality, and how do you deal with issues that really pushed, to an extent, the the envelope with the interpretation of the Bill of Rights, particularly free speech and press and things along those lines. Okay, that's what really context is going to do. Now, with context, you don't have to describe every single little event of, especially if you're in a timed writing, guys. Those of you that take AP and standard, even standard and honors to an extent, will see this too. but you're showing the reader, your teacher, publisher, if you go on to write things for that, that you really understand the situation. Look what it says next. Using contextualization is a, quote, open door to a main argument. What do we mean by this? Basically, what you're doing is that you're providing insight, background, we just said that word a moment ago, and basically historical, basically historical, situation, as some people call it, to actually show the reader, here's what's proceeding, and then you take a position on whatever issue that you're talking about. Okay. A couple of years ago, I did a graduate exam that required us to defend whether or not Washington, referring to spirit of party, having quote unquote baneful effects in his farewell address, was actually accurate. Okay. Obviously, there's an argument to be made. That's what you're basically doing. Okay. Is you're providing background that sets up your argument. Okay, so how do we set the scene or demonstrate contextualization with our writing? We're going to get good at this throughout the year, guys. So just keep that in mind. There's no substitute for practice. So make this a skill that you think and make it habitual. Establish surrounding background. We just covered that. What are some things under the era of Washington? Specifics, guys, not generalizations. Context, needs to have some degree of specifics, right? Additional outside evidence, if you will. All right. Secondly, consider the preceding events and developments that happen immediately before. We just covered that. So preceding, in other words. Thirdly, make a clear connection between the context and the significance of your argument. Okay. What are we talking about there? We are talking about, we are not just going to throw Washington had a cabinet. He had a whiskey rebellion that happened, right? You want to make sure that you are developing the use of those contextualization facts in a way that basically supports an argument. All right. So for example, if you're being asked to defend a position about the success and or failure of the early presidency or the early, part of the republic to actually move the country in a state of, let's say, positive, direction. Okay. You might be setting that up to show that, there's a lot of division that therefore makes moving in the direction of the presidency and beyond a much more difficult challenge. Okay. So it's the way that you use those facts of context to set up that argument that matters. Okay. Fourthly, your context is usually going to be or have 2 to 3 ideas or pieces of evidence to show the reader that you understand the quote historical situation you are ready to write about. One of the things that I do not prefer students to ask me is how long do essays need to be? How long do support paragraphs need to be? Later on down the line, we will talk about how to frame that. I would say that if you really want to develop context, again, you don't have to write the book on this, but I would say a good contextualization that introduce a thesis or support, put support statement or whatever you want to call it, is probably going to be about 4 to 5 sentences that, again, has good ideas, connects it, and then, of course, you drive it with your thesis. The purpose of today is not to go into the direction of a thesis statement, but it's to go in the direction of how to set one up, which is kind of what context does, okay, in this respect. So what I want you all to do, if you're here, you'll practice this. If you're watching, then this might be something for you to do on your own time. Pause it. Okay, so what you want to think about as a standard honors prompt to get you to write about contextualization here is, this coming week, week 2, we're going to study Jefferson in more detail. We're going to study John Adams, and your document assignment or your application assignment, if you want to use that expression, is basically going to be breaking down a couple of different things for Adams and Jefferson, also Hamilton. Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to really think about, the idea of how their presidencies are going to basically do things. The question you might want to think about is, write a 4 to 5 sentence paragraph that shows the context of events that led up to the presidencies. Now, I don't want you to write a thesis statement unless you want to, but the hint with this, and you're not always going to have this. So guys, you want to develop this into basically habit. How do the events or developments under the president prior to these two issues that are still have issues, pardon me, present when Adams and Jefferson take office? Okay. Because both of them are going to be dealing with a lot of the same issues as Washington. Okay. If you're an AP this week, basically we're going to start to look at British colonial settlement. Okay. So we're kind of transitioning from time period 1 to time period 2 for the next few weeks. I want you all to basically write down a 4 to 5 sentence paragraph. Again, thesis is fine, but you're not going to be required to do that. But we're working on context for now. So kind of baby steps or kind of tiering steps, guys, to basically develop. Thesis will be in the future, support paragraphs, complexity within those. And then, of course, if you can do an introduction, usually a conclusion comes easier. Okay. But for AP, you want to think about how do you show the context of events or developments leading up to British settlement that would show an understanding of the New World prior to British settlement. Okay. I don't have a hint for you all in here, but remember, time period 2 starts with 1607, all right, which is going to be, the settlement of permanent settlement in Jamestown. Okay. Think about some of the context related to exploration and what really starts to make a lot of these countries put themselves on the map, from the process of colonization. This is Mr. Baker. This is the end of Baker's Corner. Hope you all have a great time. Have a great, rest of your week or whatever you're doing. Hope you all if you need to email me, bakerd@franklineconomy.org. I hope that you're putting these principles into practice. And as always, please take care, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.